My parents tried to rob me of my hard-earned college fund to finance my sister's dream apartment. My name is Ethan, and I'm 19 years old. I grew up in a suburban neighborhood outside of Denver, Colorado, in what most people assumed was a normal, supportive family. From the outside, our house looked picture perfect. My dad, Steven, worked as a project manager for a local firm, and my mom, Carol, stayed busy organizing community events and volunteering. We even had a big backyard with a worn-out basketball hoop where I'd shoot around after school. But if you looked past the manicured lawn and the polite smiles, you'd see a very different story. You see, I have an older sister named Heather. She's 24, and for as long as I can remember, our parents have treated her like she could do no wrong. In my earliest memories, she was the gifted child, the one who got away with anything, a broken lamp, a sassy comment, or a poor grade. While I was expected to be the reliable, no-trouble son. My job, as far as they were concerned, was to be responsible, keep my head down, and make everyone else's life easier. Heather, on the other hand, seemed to drift through life without a care or consequence. I can't count the number of times I heard my dad say, "Heather's just finding herself," or my mom exclaim, "She's so creative, she just needs the right opportunity," whenever my sister started something new and promptly quit. The result was always the same. She'd laze around at home, watch TV, meet up with friends, and complain about not having spending money. Our parents would inevitably cave, handing her cash or covering her latest whim. Like the time she decided she needed professional guitar lessons, only to drop them a few weeks later. Meanwhile, I was on an entirely different path. From the moment I could legally work, I took on part-time jobs, working to register at a local bookstore, flipping burgers at a nearby diner, and even doing summer lawn mowing for neighbors. I saved every cent I could, always with the same goal in mind: college. College was my escape route, the way I'd finally shape my own life and stop feeling overshadowed by Heather's endless demands. Between wages from these jobs, plus a few small scholarships I hustled to get, I managed to accumulate around $30,000. A small fortune in my eyes, and hopefully enough to ease the burden of tuition for the first couple of years. Sure, my parents said they supported my plans. They'd pat me on the back whenever I brought home a good report card, but it felt like an afterthought compared to how they fawned over Heather for every minor thing she did. As a kid, I thought if I just worked hard enough, if I got straight A's, stayed out of trouble, saved money, my parents would one day notice and appreciate me. But Heather's wants always seemed more urgent, more special, so my achievements often went overlooked. As the years went on, Heather slid into a pattern of laziness and entitlement. She rarely held a job for longer than a month and seemed proud of the fact that she could make do by borrowing from mom and dad. By age 24, she still lived at home, hopped from one short-lived interest to another, and never seriously considered moving out or growing up. That should have raised eyebrows, but my parents remained blind to it, acting like her big break was just around the corner. Meanwhile, I was set to start college soon. I'd been accepted to a state university just over an hour away, planning to use that $30,000 I'd painstakingly saved to cover tuition, housing, and books. While my parents verbally congratulated me, their excitement never matched the gusto they showed every time Heather so much as hinted at a new hobby. It was a quiet frustration, like a heavy weight I carried around, knowing I had to rely on myself to get anywhere in life. I had no idea just how far they'd go to maintain Heather's comfortable, consequence-free world, nor how much they'd demand that I sacrifice to keep it that way. Right around the time I was finalizing my college enrollment, Heather dropped another of her life-changing announcements. She declared she was tired of living under our parents' roof and deserved a nicer place in a decent neighborhood, preferably one closer to the trendy side of town. As usual, she hadn't saved a dime, nor did she have a stable job lined up. But that didn't stop her from telling everyone she needed this and would make it happen. At first, I didn't pay much attention. Heather was always jumping from one idea to the next. First it was taking guitar lessons, then volunteering abroad, now an upscale apartment. I assumed our parents, Steven and Carol, would offer their usual sympathy, but also remind her that she needed to get a job or at least show some sign of responsibility. But the conversation at dinner one night took me completely off guard. My dad cleared his throat and said, "Ethan, we have a plan we need to discuss with you." My mom nodded, forcing a tight smile. Meanwhile, Heather sat at the table flipping through a real estate brochure, as if this was all a done deal. Dad went on to explain that Heather had found a perfect apartment in one of the nicer neighborhoods in downtown Denver. Of course, the rent was high, and she needed a hefty deposit. She's short on funds, my mom said in that apologetic tone she uses when she's about to ask me for something big. "And we've decided it would be best for the family if you helped out." I blinked, not quite grasping what they meant. Help out could have meant I'd co-sign a lease or contribute a few $100s. But then Heather chimed in, "You've got like 30 grand saved, right? That would cover everything I need to secure the apartment. I can pay you back eventually, or maybe we can figure something out." I stared at her, waiting for the punchline. When none came, I asked, "Are you serious?" Heather rolled her eyes, as though I was the one being unreasonable. Then Dad spoke again, more firmly this time. "Yes, we're serious. Your sister needs this more than you need the money right now. You're still young. You can always take out loans or work to cover college." My heart pounded. This was money I'd spent years earning, through multiple part-time jobs, scholarships, even holiday tips. I'd guarded it fiercely, seeing it as my ticket to an independent life. Now my family was telling me I should just hand it all over, so Heather could move into a fancy apartment? Sensing my disbelief, Mom added, "Honey, it's not like you won't be going to college. You'll just have to manage a little differently. After all, family supports each other." Her voice carried an edge, though. This wasn't a gentle suggestion, but a nudge toward compliance. I tried to explain how crucial that $30,000 was. I'd crunched the numbers a million times. That money was the bridge between me and crushing student debt, the cushion that might keep me afloat if something went wrong. But Dad cut me off. "Are you saying your sister doesn't deserve a safe place to live? She's part of this family, and we take care of our own." Then the ultimatum landed like a punch to the gut. "If you won't step up and help Heather, you can pack your things and find somewhere else to stay. We won't tolerate selfishness under this roof." My face flushed with anger and shock. Was I hearing correctly? They were effectively threatening to throw me out if I didn't hand over my entire college fund. Heather didn't even glance up from her brochure. She only shrugged, as if to say, "It is what it is." I felt cornered. Either I sacrifice everything I'd saved, or I'd be cut off from the only home I'd ever known. And part of me wondered if they'd really do it. Would they honestly cast me out just so Heather could live comfortably? Yet looking at Dad's stony expression and Mom's stern nod, I realized they might. I mumbled something about needing time to think, and they all just stared at me. Heather impatient, my parents expectant, as though waiting for me to cave in. Eventually, I stood up and left the table. Back in my room, I stared at the bank statements, my heart racing. How had it come to this? It wasn't just about money now. It was about respect, validation, and the possibility that my family might turn its back on me for refusing to enable my sister's endless demands. For a few hours after that dinner, I genuinely thought I might cave. I mean, these were my parents, people I'd lived with my whole life. The idea of losing their support, or worse, being forced out, filled me with a swirling dread. Yet something inside me rebelled at the thought of handing over my hard-earned $30,000 just so Heather could live in a trendy apartment she hadn't lifted a finger to afford. It wasn't just about the money. It was about the principle. The next day, I tried to reason with my parents over breakfast. I calmly explained that I'd spent years saving, working odd jobs, and applying for scholarships to get that money. "It's not spare cash," I emphasized. "It's my entire college plan." But Mom shook her head with exasperation. "Don't be dramatic. You're young. You can always take out student loans or pick up an extra job. Heather needs this more right now." Heather, of course, took advantage of this stance. She lounged in the living room, theatrically sighing every time I walked by, making pointed comments about how I was letting the family down and how any decent brother would do this without question. She'd trail off in a wail. If he even cared about us, he'd help me out. Guess he doesn't love us after all. It was pure emotional blackmail, and I could feel my anger rising with each snide remark. Dad upped the ante by trying to guilt-trip me whenever we were alone. "Look, Ethan," he'd say, his voice loaded with that fatherly authority. "Family has to come first. That's how I was raised, and it's how you should be. Don't turn your back on your sister." The implication, of course, was that if I didn't fork over the money, I'd be turning my back on them all. At the same time, Mom would switch tactics, scolding me for being selfish and accusing me of hoarding money I didn't really need. She even suggested that I should feel grateful they'd let me stay at home rent-free while I saved up, as if that obligated me to transfer everything I'd ever earned to Heather now. The worst was Heather's meltdown one afternoon. I was in my room, trying to research potential part-time gigs I could do if I ended up homeless, when she burst in uninvited, tears streaking down her cheeks. "How could you do this to me?" she yelled, throwing her arms in the air. "You know I can't get that apartment without you." She went on and on about how I was trying to sabotage her future, how I was jealous of her, which made zero sense, and how I'd regret being so cruel. I stood there, feeling the familiar knot of anxiety tightening in my stomach, but something snapped. I realized I wasn't at fault here. She was. They all were. I stared her down and told her that my decision was final. I would not be handing over my college fund. If that meant being kicked out, so be it. She stormed out, slamming the door so hard it rattled the window. I took a shaky breath, then began preparing for the worst. I made sure to gather every important document, passport, birth certificate, bank statements, and stash them in a small safe I'd bought online. I also began discreetly packing my laptop, a few changes of clothes, and some sentimental items, placing them in a duffel bag under my bed. In case I needed to leave in a hurry, I wouldn't be caught off guard. Next, I reached out to a close friend who had already moved into an off-campus apartment near my chosen college. I asked if there was a possibility of crashing on their couch if it came down to it. They didn't hesitate, welcoming me with open arms if I got the boot. I also emailed the housing office at my future college, explaining I might need emergency accommodations. They sympathized, though their immediate options were limited. Still, just having that lifeline eased my mind. With each step, the knot in my stomach loosened just a bit. I was done feeling guilty for wanting to keep what I'd earned. If my parents truly couldn't see how absurd their demand was, maybe it was time to stand on my own, no matter how scary that prospect might be. Sure, the emotional onslaught continued. The pointed glares from Dad, the silent treatment from Mom, Heather's loud tantrums heard through the walls, but I felt oddly calm. I'd made my choice, and they'd have to live with it. Whether they'd actually go through with throwing me out remained to be seen, but at least I knew I wasn't caving. And in a twisted way, that realization felt empowering. The breaking point came sooner than I expected. One evening, I was in the living room, scrolling through college emails on my phone, when I received a sudden alert from my bank app. It was a security notification. Someone was attempting to access my account using incorrect credentials. My heart started racing. I had a sinking suspicion who might be behind it. Without wasting a moment, I rushed to my room, booted up my laptop, and logged into my online banking. There, in clear detail, I saw that an attempt had been made to withdraw the entire balance. I couldn't believe my eyes. My parents must have tried to get their hands on my savings directly. In a swirl of panic, I did the only thing I could think of. I transferred the money into a new account I'd set up a few days prior, closed the old one, and ensured there was no way they could access it. I sat there for a moment, trembling, as the realization sank in. They weren't satisfied with threats or guilt trips. They'd actually tried to steal the money themselves. This was no longer a spat about helping family. It was a direct betrayal of trust. My anger mingled with a deep sense of hurt. These were my parents, the people who were supposed to protect me, yet they were stealing from me. I heard footsteps in the hallway, and soon my dad, Stephen, burst into my bedroom, followed by my mom, Carol. Dad looked furious, his face red, and Mom seemed teary-eyed but determined. "You changed your password or something?" my dad demanded. "We couldn't get the funds out. Why on earth would you lock us out of an account we should have access to?" I stared at him in disbelief. "That's my account. My money. You had no right. You're our son," my mom cut in, voice trembling. "We've taken care of you your whole life. Now we just need you to do the same for your sister. Don't talk like I owe you everything." I snapped, my anger rising to match theirs. I paid for that with my own jobs and scholarships. It's not yours to take. My dad slammed a fist against the doorframe. We're your parents, and we make the decisions around here. How dare you shut us out like this? You've betrayed your family, Ethan. You have no idea what you're doing. Mom's tears started flowing more freely. Why are you doing this? Don't you understand how much it hurts me to see you tear this family apart over something like money? You're going to cost Heather her chance at a decent life. For a second, I almost felt a pang of guilt. But then I remembered they had literally tried to steal the money behind my back. They'd shown no respect for my hard work or my dreams. Gathering what remained of my composure, I took a deep breath. No, you're the ones tearing this family apart by siding with Heather at my expense. I'm done. The room fell silent. Dad glowered at me, jaw clenched, and Mom let out a choked sob. I think they both expected me to cave in fear or shame. Instead, I stood up, bracing myself. If you want me gone, I said quietly, I'll leave tonight. I'm not giving Sarah a dime. My dad's face twitched with fury, but he just jerked his head toward the door, as if I should already be on my way. Mom kept sobbing, muttering something about how cold and ungrateful I was. Without another word, I grabbed my packed duffel bag from under the bed, the one I prepared in case it came to this. They watched me walk out of my own bedroom, down the hall, and toward the front door. Dad didn't try to stop me. Mom only whispered, I can't believe you'd do this. But I couldn't muster any more words. In that final moment, I realized my relationship with them might never be the same. For the sake of my future, however, I had no choice but to go. I didn't leave quietly. After stepping away from my parents' house with nothing but a duffel bag and my own determination, I decided the world should know exactly why it had come to this. There would be no vague rumors or half-truths whispered behind closed doors. If my parents and sister wanted to call me the disloyal one, I'd show everyone the real story. That very night, while settling onto a friend's couch, my temporary new home, I composed a lengthy post on my social media accounts. In it, I recounted the entire saga from start to finish. How my sister Heather insisted on an upscale apartment she couldn't afford, how my parents demanded I fork over my $30,000 college fund, and how they threatened to kick me out if I refused. More importantly, I included screenshots of text messages from them, along with snapshots of bank alerts showing my parents' attempt to withdraw my funds without my consent. The evidence spoke volumes, leaving little room for alternative interpretations. I hesitated for a moment before hitting post, knowing it would ignite a wildfire of controversy among my relatives, family, friends, and even some of my high school acquaintances. But deep down, I felt it was necessary. I didn't want them spinning a narrative that I was just a selfish kid who left on a whim. In a matter of hours, the post went viral within our local circle. Friends I hadn't spoken to in years chimed in with messages of disbelief or support. Distant cousins reached out, horrified by what they were reading. Some people simply commented, "Unbelievable," or "I'm so sorry this happened to you." The reaction among my relatives was swift. Apparently, my grandparents and a few aunts had been aware that my parents strongly favored Heather, but they'd had no idea the situation was this extreme. Once they saw the screenshots, actual proof that my parents tried to steal my money, any lingering benefit of the doubt vanished. I started receiving calls of support, some from family members I barely knew, saying they stood behind me and were appalled by my parents' behavior. Meanwhile, word got back to Heather's potential landlord about the drama. I don't know if someone forwarded my post or if they caught wind through local gossip, but the end result was the same. The landlord got cold feet. I heard from a mutual acquaintance that the landlord was unwilling to rent to someone at the center of such a public financial scandal. Heather lost her dream apartment before she even had a chance to sign a lease. She tried blaming me for humiliating her in front of the entire community, but she brought this on herself. After all, her plan hinged on my stolen savings. My parents fared no better. Their polished reputation took a serious hit among friends and colleagues. It turned out that a few of my dad's business associates had seen the post and confronted him. After all, who wants to partner with someone who would betray their own child's educational future? While the scandal was raging, I focused on building a life outside their shadow. I managed to move in with a close friend who had an extra room for rent, paying a modest sum from what I'd saved after staving off my parents. Even though I didn't have their financial support, I juggled a part-time job with a heavy course load at college. It was tough. Living costs piled up and scholarships only covered so much, but I finally felt like my life was my own to shape. Support from online friends and acquaintances poured in. Some offered me a temporary place to stay or pointed me toward more substantial scholarships and part-time gigs. Little by little, I pieced together a stable existence. Sure, it was far from luxurious. My friend's place was cramped, and I had to budget every penny for textbooks, tuition, and groceries. But it was honest, and it was mine. There were moments I missed having a normal family, especially when I saw classmates get care packages or notes of encouragement from their parents. But each time the sadness crept in, I remembered what my parents and sister had tried to do. They wanted to mortgage my future so Heather could live comfortably. Now, exposed for what they really were, they had only themselves to blame. And I, for the first time, had real freedom. Once the dust settled from the social media uproar, my parents launched a frantic mission to repair the family's fractured image. The nature of their messages to me was all over the place. One day, my mother, Carol, would send a long text lamenting how much she missed me and begging me to come home so we could work things out. The next day, my dad, Stephen, would leave a bitter voicemail blaming me for publicly humiliating them and warning me that I'd regret crossing them. Their approaches swung wildly between apologies and threats, never once acknowledging how they'd engineered this entire disaster by demanding I sacrifice my future for Heather's whims. Heather, as expected, had her own narrative. She continued to paint me as the villain who single-handedly crushed her dreams. According to her twisted retelling, I'd refused to help her move into a place she deserved, then broadcasted our family's issues for the world to see. She told mutual acquaintances that I was jealous of her, angry that she'd be living a more comfortable life. The irony, of course, was that she never secured that fancy apartment, and the landlord had backed out. Yet she never admitted it was her own entitlement that caused her downfall, preferring to heap blame on me. Meanwhile, the public backlash was real and immediate. People we knew, family, friends, distant relatives, neighbors rallied around me. They recognized that my parents had enabled Heather for years, tolerating or even celebrating her laziness and arrogance. Now, with direct evidence of their attempt to seize my college fund, any illusions of perfect parenting they projected vanished. In fact, I began receiving messages from relatives I barely knew, commending my courage in exposing the truth. Some wrote to me privately to express remorse for not stepping in sooner, recalling how they'd witnessed my parents' favoritism toward Heather but never spoke up. The more they tried to spin the story, the less credible my parents appeared. People saw them for what they were, two adults who demanded a 19-year-old give up his entire life savings so their favored daughter could live in a trendy condo. Even older relatives, who often preached about keeping family matters private, had to concede that this time the parents had gone too far. I no longer needed to defend myself. My story and the screenshots I'd shared spoke for themselves. All of this propelled me to adopt a firm, no-contact stance. It wasn't that I wanted to sever ties purely out of spite, though anger certainly played a role, but rather that I couldn't see a healthy way forward with people who'd so thoroughly shattered my trust. Whenever Mom tried the guilt angle, or Dad threatened legal action for defamation, I reminded myself they were reaping the consequences of their own actions. Heather's ongoing attempts to guilt me were equally fruitless. She cried that I'd destroyed her chance at a better life, never acknowledging how I'd spent years sacrificing to earn my college fund in the first place. Through all of this, I've grown more determined not to let them back in. A few times, I caught myself considering a reconciliation. The small part of me that still yearns for a normal family wondered if maybe, with enough apologies, we could build bridges. But each time I glanced at another manipulative text from Dad, or read yet another guilt-tripping message from Mom, I realized that nothing had really changed. They wanted to save face, not genuinely make amends. I stand by my decision. My parents and Heather ruined the relationship themselves, expecting me to shoulder the blame and cost of their poor choices. I'm staying resolute in my position, even when they send messages claiming they regret everything and promise they won't treat me unfairly anymore. If they genuinely understood the damage they'd done, they would respect my boundaries and recognize that some wrongs can't be patched up overnight. For me, life goes on. I continue living with friends, juggling work and school. It's not easy, but there's a certain peace that comes from knowing I don't have to keep looking over my shoulder, worried my own family might sabotage me again. In time, maybe I'll reconsider whether I can forgive them at all. But for now, I'm focusing on my studies, my part-time job, and the healthy friendships I've built, free from the toxicity that once surrounded me. And if my parents ever truly want a shot at reconciliation, they'll have to prove they've changed not just in words but in actions. Until then, I can't risk letting them back into my life. Sometimes that's what self-preservation looks like, that it's been about a year since that whole fiasco exploded and I walked away from my parents' house for good. In that time, I've managed to carve out a life that's surprisingly fulfilling, even if it came with a lot of hard work and emotional baggage. I found a small apartment a few towns over, splitting the rent with a friend from college. Between my part-time job at a local tech support center and the scholarships I still qualify for, I can cover tuition and keep a modest but comfortable lifestyle. Looking back, it's almost surreal how drastic the change has been. A year ago, I felt suffocated, like my entire future depended on whether my parents and sister would let me keep my own savings. I was constantly on edge, anticipating the next guilt trip or emotional outburst. Now, I get up each morning with a sense of purpose, focusing on my upcoming finals or balancing my shift schedules, or even planning weekend outings with my new friends. It's not perfect. I still have student loans to think about, and my budget's tighter than I'd like. But I wake up each day grateful for my autonomy. Occasionally, through distant relatives or mutual acquaintances, I hear snippets about how my parents are handling the aftermath. According to these sources, things haven't gone well for them. My dad, who always valued his professional image, found that the story of trying to seize his son's college fund damaged his standing at work. Some colleagues keep their distance, uneasy about the ethics behind such a move. My mom, who used to be a big social figure in the community, faces polite but strained receptions at events. People whisper, but rarely to her face. Still, the tension lingers. As for my sister Heather, she's managed to do more harm to the family name than ever. She allegedly got involved in another ill-advised venture, some fast money scheme that flopped and left a couple of people feeling swindled. I don't know all the details, but her behavior continues to spark rumors. The last I heard, she hopped between short-term rentals, none of which matched the luxurious apartment she once insisted she deserved. Rumor is she's burned bridges with yet more friends who've grown tired of her entitled attitude. In financial terms, my parents have apparently dipped into their retirement savings to cover some of Heather's misadventures, leaving them with more debt than they planned for. They're paying a steep price for having placed her once above everything else, even basic financial sense. It's unfortunate, but I also think it was their own doing. They enabled her for years, brushing aside any warning signs. Occasionally, relatives who still talk to me ask if I consider giving them another chance. I politely decline. Forgiveness can happen without returning to a toxic dynamic, and I still see no evidence that my parents or Heather have truly changed. They may regret the consequences, loss of status, financial strain, but regret isn't the same as genuine remorse or transformed behavior. Moreover, life without their looming demands and manipulations is infinitely more peaceful. I attend classes, work my shifts, and even have some spare time to explore hobbies I never had the emotional space for before. Every so often, a sense of nostalgia tugs at me when I see other families doing things together, like celebrating birthdays or supporting each other's milestones. But then I remember the stress, the guilt trips, and the brazen attempt to rob me of my own future. I remind myself that I'm doing better now. My academic performance has soared because I can finally concentrate, free from the endless drama. My circle of friends has become a supportive surrogate family, one that encourages me and respects my boundaries. A year ago, I might have felt pangs of shame or sorrow admitting I was estranged from my entire family. Now I just feel relieved. I've realized that being alone doesn't necessarily mean being lonely, especially when the relationships you're cutting off were never healthy to begin with. If my parents and sister ever take genuine steps to own their mistakes and change their behavior, maybe we can talk. But that's on them, not me. For now, I'm focusing on the life I've built for myself, one free from the toxic influences that try to drag me down. If there's a lesson in all this, it's that sometimes you have to walk away from the people who claim to love you, especially if they love you conditionally. You can be the best sibling or child in the world, but if your family is determined to only see you as a resource, then you owe it to yourself to move on. And moving on has turned out to be the best decision I've ever made.